Powerful Conversations Humanhood, a podcast where we confront America's adopted psychopathic nature by diving headfirst into difficult and honest conversations about the state of humanhood. I'm your host, Tamara Graham, with co-host Leisha Moody Miller. We welcome you to the conversation. This episode is sponsored by Square 5, powerful products that confronts our internal dialogue to help inspire our external dialogue for a more purposeful, driven world. Command your voice at square5.com. That's SQUARE5IVE.com. Mary Jane Evnick is a lifelong learner who graduated from the University of Michigan, where she studied history and psychology. She served as a high school teacher before becoming the Director of Curriculum and Instructional Services at a West Michigan school district. Mary Jane is speaking with us today on the important subject of book banning in her personal capacity and not in any way as part of her official duties for her employer. Dan Martin is also joining us as a guest today. Dan graduated from Albion College in 1992, where he studied political science and philosophy, and from Notre Dame Law School in 1995. For more than 25 years, Dan has provided legal representation to numerous school districts throughout the state of Michigan. He's also taught constitutional law and educational law at Grand Valley State University. Well, Dan and Mary Jane, welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about what I'm calling modern day book burning, with the banning of books that we are facing in the United States of America in 2022. We all have our own opinions about this, I'm sure. But Mary Jane, I want to start with you and what you see as the start of this current crusade of banning books. Like, what the hell are parents afraid of? What is going on?
Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. That's a good question. I think there's a number of root causes to this fear that we're having. And one of them that I'm hearing in the general public is trust in schools, which I really don't understand because schools are still the same. We haven't changed. There's this question of what are you teaching our children? And sometimes are you teaching them to be progressive? So we have to remind parents that indoctrination is a dirty word in public education, and that we not only encourage, our teachers believe in neutrality and teaching how to think and not what to think. And it feels like some parents might be making up stories in their head. To quote Brene Brown, the story in my head is that the schools are teaching a particular way of thinking, and that's not true.
Where does that stem from, do you think?
Oh my goodness.
You can be honest. Say it.
You're asking me a question that I don't usually answer, but my honest answer is, I think that politics have a large role in this. There's no question in my mind that politicians are using education as a political tool to say, I'm on your side and there's something that's not right, and I'm going to help you get what you need.
Do you see the start of this kind of happening since COVID, or was it before COVID, or was it around the time of the discussion of teaching critical race theory in school, which is not something that it even exists at the elementary level or even high school level? Do you think it started around that, or did it start prior to that?
It most certainly started after COVID began. Teachers were in the living rooms of families when lessons were happening, when we were teaching virtually. And so parents saw what was going on. And the first reaction was, thank you, teachers. Thank you, education, for pivoting and providing these lessons when we didn't even know what to do. And that felt really good because we were all under some pressure. But it wasn't long after that. I could probably point to some events of the summer of 2020 that maybe led to some more questioning about what our teachers doing.
What do you think those events are?
Well, I believe that the murder of George Floyd and other shootings really came into the consciousness of white people, and white people started to say, I want to do something about this. And this change probably led to something like a moral panic. That's a sociology term and trend. When change happens really fast, a lot of people like to blame morality for the change. And it's easy to blame books and schools and who gets to use what bathroom when change like that happens. But from my personal perspective, that summer was a very fascinating summer because of the highs and the lows. People wanted to help and people resisted.
Did it really make a difference, like, coming back in the fall? Were parents involved right away with calling for the banning of books? Because George Floyd happened in May, I believe, of 2020. I believe it was May. And then there was summer vacation, and then we were starting a new election cycle.
So I will tell you, it was October of 2020 when our first parent came to the Board of Education meeting and spoke against curriculum that was being taught in the schools that asked kids to just have a critical analysis, take different perspectives on how a story perceived race in an essay or a piece of literature. And there were many people that spoke. It wasn't just one parent, there were many people who spoke.
That's what education is about, right? Isn't that where we send our kids to school so they can learn to think and ask questions and exchange ideas and experiences? What types of books were they wanting to ban in your area?
So, while some people pointed to specific essays in the AP literature class, the books that they specifically pointed out were titles like Queer, A Graphic History, Monday's Not Coming, Girls That Bind. There was a long list. Their initial list was 15 titles, and the librarians and I met with the community members who had opposition to this and said, "We'll read the books. We'll read them with you. Let's read them in their entirety and see what does this whole work bring to the student body, and is it damaging, or does it bring something or a perspective that might need to be present?" We read them. Many of them were by authors that are non-white and so have a different perspective and bring that lens to the student body. The district that I work in is primarily Caucasian. So those students that aren't need books so that they have the mirrors. Okay, we talk about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. You need to see windows into families and communities that don't look like yours. You need mirrors to see characters and experiences that resemble yours. And you need those sliding glass doors so you can walk right into those worlds with books.
I think that one of the reasons that people are focusing on public schools is because it's what is educating the future generations of our country. There's a culture war going on. The public schools are a battlefront for it. The other piece that I think it is while not everybody has gone to law school or medical school, every adult has been through the education system, whether public or private. And for that reason, I think a lot of parents, having gone through school, feel like they know what teachers should or shouldn't teach. That suddenly they are, in a sense, an expert on education because they've gone through education and they know what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And so they kind of project that out and go after the public school. I also think that a lot of these organizations are becoming much more organized. Like a lot of parents are starting to form organizations in order to challenge public schools. As Mary Jane said, there's a group of people that came to challenge the books. There are groups of people in Mary Jane's community that are going online and creating reviews of books that are still available at the schools that they find inappropriate, and they're listing the page numbers and the content that they deem inappropriate on these blogs. And I think free speech in that manner to let other parents know what other parents find objectionable is much better than removing the book from the school. So speech, encountering speech is better than censorship. But I think parents feel that because they've been through school, because this is a battleground for our current culture and for our future, that's why they're really attacking schools.
So are these parents that in the school district that you're in, what is their education level? Are a majority of them highly educated? Are they middle class? Where do they fall? Because I feel like that has a lot to do, honestly, with the opinion of what kids are being taught in school.
Oddly, at the Board of Education meetings where they speak, many of them have explained their jobs and their education background, and most of them have college degrees.
But I agree with Dan. What's happening here in Colorado is they're organizing and they're electing people to the school board who are in step with their belief system. So that organization has made strides in certain school districts, including my own school district. They just ousted the superintendent, who was after the new school board members came in, because the superintendent was a proponent of inclusion and diversity. And there was a huge movement around that. And I mean, as soon as these new school board members came aboard, and this has happened in multiple school systems in Colorado, as soon as the school board members came aboard, they politically started removing administrative people.
Oh my goodness.
So it's organized. It's very organized. And they're targeting communities at a community level to make change and to make waves that way.
Do you guys see that in your school districts in the area that you are as well?
We do. This parent organization has a webpage, and they're very clearly stated that they're out to take the 3 Board of Education seats that are up for reelection in November. And what does that mean? That means that we have to step up and say no. We have to answer to their complaints. We have to answer to their misinformation. We have to answer to their lack of advocacy to the marginalized students. We got to organize ourselves, right?
What role does a school board play in choosing curriculum, however? Dan, is there like a are the educators protected? Are the students protected at some level legally to where parents can't just come in and say, "We don't want to teach this"?
That's a good question. And there's a distinction between the curriculum and library books. So I'm glad that you raised that question because when we talk about banning books, you really need to understand the difference between books that are used as part of the curriculum, where the school board has much more discretion over what books they select and what books they can essentially require teachers to teach or not teach, versus books that are in the library. The United States Supreme Court, in a case back in the early 80s, the Pico case, basically said that students' right to free speech includes the right to receive information in the context of library books being removed from library bookshelves. And the court, it's what you refer to as a plurality opinion. There wasn't a majority of the justices who agreed with the reasoning, but they agreed with the outcome that the school district was violating students' First Amendment rights. But the opinion of 4 of the court members basically acknowledged the voluntariness of students reading from a library book, that students have that choice to receive that information. It's part of free speech, even though they are not necessarily speaking, they're receiving that information. And that's why library books are treated differently than the curriculum. With respect to the curriculum, there's no voluntariness. Students go to school, they're taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. The school board generally gets to select the curriculum, and I'll have Mary Jane explain a little bit more because she's a curriculum director, because the administration is playing a big part in that. But when it comes to the First Amendment rights of students and teachers, they don't have that same right with respect to curriculum that they do with respect to library books. There was a court case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which controls over Michigan, and a teacher had a list of books that students could choose to read from as part of the curriculum, sort of an English class, to kind of provide these windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, as Mary Jane was talking about. And some school board members got upset about that. The teacher ended up having her contract not renewed, and she sued for a First Amendment violation. And the court acknowledged that she did not have First Amendment rights because she was speaking in her official capacity as a teacher, and the school district could control and govern the curriculum. And so you kind of have to make that distinction. And so when it comes to selecting the curriculum, most school districts that I work with do have people like Mary Jane, who are curriculum directors, who are making recommendations to the board, but the board ultimately approves it.
So board members with essentially no background in education possibly could be making the decisions about what is taught to our children.
Correct. But then again, we previously had a cabinet member at the federal level from the United States Department of Education who had no background in education other than trying to
True.
destroy public education in the state of Michigan.
True story.
Oh,
And
Betsy.
literally lives like in our backyard type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I had no idea that school boards had that much power, you know?
I didn't realize that either.
And I think that's another one of the reasons why schools are coming under attack in the culture wars. It's a lot easier, more convenient to drive down to the school board meeting than it is to go to Washington, D.C. Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. When I went to law school, I really loved the Constitution. I love US history. I'm of the mind that I love my country, but love isn't blind. Love is forgiving. So, whether you're in a relationship with a significant other and you love them, they're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes because we're, from a biblical theological standpoint, are fallen creatures with original sin who are going to make mistakes. So we kind of need forgiveness. Same thing with all of our favorite founding fathers. The thing is by politics being local, the more impact that parents can have is at the local level than the federal level. Yeah, we do have things with Common Core that are coming down through the curriculum, No Child Left Behind, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, even Title IX issues that are federally regulated. But if you look at the United States Constitution, in all reality, the federal government doesn't have any authority over education. They kind of come at it through different directions, through spending with like No Child Left Behind, through equal protection under the 14th Amendment with Title IX, those types of things. But when it comes to the states having that power, the states really give it to the local school boards who are the true representative democracy. These are the people that you're really going to know, that you probably go to coffee with, that you're going to see, you're going to be closer to, and you can put a lot more pressure on them than you can even your state representative, let alone your congressional representative that goes off to Washington, D.C.
That makes sense. I never thought about that. I never thought that they would use local school districts as their battleground.
It's a little frightening to me.
Very frightening because it's happening. It's already happening. Like we're already in the middle of it. We have to organize quickly to really combat this.
And there really doesn't seem that there's a lot of organization to combat it happening outside of a school level. Do you see that, Mary Jane? Do you see parents who are against these book bannings standing up and organizing?
Well, I do have a little bit of good news on that front.
Oh, good.
So the book banners had been at multiple Board of Education meetings, and finally we said, let's call our friends in and ask if they'd be willing to come to the next Board of Education meeting. And we had 137 members present, and probably 127 of them were in support of the libraries as they currently exist. And we had 7 students speak up in favor of books so eloquently. We had another 7 adults speak in favor of the libraries as they currently exist, and 4 people speak against them. And you would guess, as you would guess, the students were the most eloquent of all the speakers. And they were very passionate and logical and convincing. So, to answer your question very specifically, I think if we ask the people to come and organize, they will.
I've read some stories about kids around the country creating their own book clubs as well, and organizing to read these books that the schools are banning, which makes me happy at every level that at least the kids are fighting back. And I think our kids are slightly more informed than my generation when we were in high school. We didn't have cell phones and social media back then, so they're able to organize better. And I think we're teaching them to organize better as well. So that makes me very happy. That gives me hope. That gives me hope that we're not going to keep going down this dark hole.
Yeah, and even like the fact that those book clubs that you're mentioning are making national news is planting the seed.
And there are organizations that have popped up. I read about one that I wanted to include in this. There was a group of moms that maybe a group of moms that came together that started an organization to collect books.
Tamara, that's not red, white, and wine, is it?
Yes, that's what it is. Thank you. I knew it was something catchy, but I couldn't remember, and because I read it about a month ago or so. It's been a while.
So let me throw an interview question at you.
Sure.
What caught your eye about this mom group?
The name was catchy, that made me stop and pause, and the fact that they were organized and it seemed a ton of people were already, like, backing them up, and it grew quickly. The movement grew quickly. What do you
What
know
is
about
it,
them?
Mary Jane?
Yeah, what
What
do you
is
know
it?
about them?
just enough to be dangerous. So these are the this is the book club that's going to, I'm going to say the anti book club.
The anti book club.
Yes. So these are the moms who support the books that are in the libraries, and they're going to read those books that are on the lists that are coming out of Texas and other places, and they're reading them, and they're giving their own reviews so that their
Oh,
voice is
wonderful.
part of the narrative.
Wonderful,
So
wonderful.
they're leading the way, like show us how to do it.
Yeah, the book I live in Austin. I think there are 108, 110, if I'm not mistaken, books on that list, or 115, something outrageous on that list, and I actually copied that list, and I posted it on my personal social media, but it's gonna be posted on our private Facebook group for the podcast as well. Texas is just Texas fell and bumped its head, let me tell you. There is just nothing positive going on there right now at all, other than that it's an election year, and let's just keep our fingers crossed there. All I can
So we
say.
can send some election donations your way.
Oh gosh. The election for governor and attorney general, they both need to go. We'll just say that for now.
Well, I would see your Texas and raise you because I grew up in
Alabama.
Alabama, and our current governor in Alabama just came out with a very bold statement about, oh, it was about CRT. And I mean, that's the way Alabama's going as well. I mean, they're going to probably come up with a list that will rival Texas's. So
They're all saying, "Here, hold my beer," honestly. Texas, Alabama, Florida, just how ridiculous they can get.
And won't kids read more now that they're banning these books?
I'm hoping
Hello,
that
come
is the
on.
case. I'm hoping that's the case.
every rebel kid is going to go out and get that list and find every book and read every piece of they can. What? So you're saying, Mary Jane, that they went after your library? So they haven't actually have they come to the school board in two to address your curriculum and changing your curriculum?
They have, but not as significantly as the library books. All their eggs are really in that basket, book by book. And oddly, not one formal book review challenge has been filed. We don't know why.
Really?
Their strategy is book by book. They have a list on their website. They're inviting parents to read as many as they can, and they're encouraging parents to fill out the district paperwork to initiate what we call a formal challenge. Because really, what we want is if there's a book they don't like, we want them to call us. Let's just talk about it. What part of the book don't you
They
like?
don't wanna read them themselves. If they actually read it, they might question their own belief system and start questioning them. Maybe they're afraid. They're afraid to read the books. That's what I'm going to say. They're afraid to read the books.
But they don't mind reading the parts that they object to.
But it seems as though, like, why do they think that would make a difference? Just because you get a book banned in a library at a public school doesn't mean, like, why. I don't understand why they think that that's going to matter. There's plenty of ways to access books, you know.
Well, the irony too is I think some parents are saying that they're not trying to ban the book. They just want it removed from the school library. So in other words, they're not technically burning the book. They're not making it so that you can't go to Barnes and Noble or Amazon or your local bookseller and buy the book. They just want it removed from the public school library. And they're trying to claim that that's not in and of itself some form of a book ban.
But, hasn't Target and Amazon banned some books, though, after these calls? Am I mistaken here? I've read a few things about and watched a few videos on the call, or authors being banned from, corporate Target, Amazon specifically. And Amazon plays such a large role in everything these days that if a book is gonna be banned on Amazon, that's like it'll never it'll ruin an author.
Yeah, I could see Target potentially saying, "We're not gonna carry a book." I would be shocked if Amazon had that kind of a policy. I'm not sure what book it would be that Amazon wouldn't sell and what content was so egregious that they're not gonna put it up for sale. Target, I think, is a little more like the Walmart. And Tamara, you and I have talked before about when I started working with clients on this issue, I immediately went back to high school and the Parents Music Resource Council and Tipper Gore wanting to effectively ban certain records. And they said, "Oh, we're not trying to ban them. We're not going to prevent them from being sold. But go to Walmart, which is one of the largest retailers that still actually stocks and sells music. that you can go to a store and buy, and they will not sell anything with a parental advisory sticker on it. It effectively has that banning effect if stores like Target or Walmart won't carry certain books. Now, that doesn't mean it's censorship because, again, under our laws, we kind of treat corporations as if though they're people, which seems a little bit strange, but they have their own First Amendment rights. And so, just as I can choose to read a book, I can choose not to read a book. A corporation can choose to sell a book or not sell a book. It's up to them. It's only when the government, like public schools, come in to say, we're going to take this book off of our library shelves, that you have a potential First Amendment violation because there's that requisite state action involved.
I want to share a little story because Dan and I went to school together. And I had an experience in the eighth grade. Mary Jane, this is what we were talking about before we went on air today. Why I think it is so critically important to teach kids about history. I had an eighth grade history teacher her name was Mrs. Helen Heyer, and she taught at my junior high school, which was also my high school in Michigan. And that woman changed my life because she taught us about the Holocaust. And she did not hold back. We read about it, we watched graphic films about it, and I am nearly 52 years old, and that class sticks with me to this day. If anybody ever brings up any question about school and what I remember, what teacher ever influenced me, without a doubt, through my education as well as college level, graduate school level, she by far touched me in a way no other teacher did. And, I grew up honestly around a lot of bigoted people in my family where I grew up in small town Michigan. And her teaching us about the Holocaust taught me about humanity and the importance of humanity and being human and seeing and recognizing people as human. And it changed the trajectory of the way my life went because it changed my thought process about people. From that class on, I started challenging people in my life who were bigoted and racist and standing up to them because of that class, because of that teacher, because of learning about the Holocaust and the atrocities of that experience for millions of people around the world. That to me is just a prime example. And I think if people talk more, maybe I'm wrong, about these experiences with teachers and how it really did change lives and changed a thought process and a mindset in somebody, that it would help at least. It would make people relate a little bit more, at least maybe stop and think about, hey, what is the lesson that we should be learning here? We are all humans and we need to treat each other as such and not dehumanize a race or an ethnic group. And that's what she taught me. Because growing up the way that I did around the people that I did, I could have turned out differently had it not been for that class. Or it may have taken me longer to realize that after I left home and went to college and had different experiences. It's such an important point, I think, about how history teaches us to be better.
So at an early age, you learned empathy and that you didn't want history to repeat itself. You wanted to use your voice to speak for others and yourself.
And I haven't stopped since. Definitely have not stopped since. I've gotten louder.
You made an important point in there too, this idea of seeing each other as humans. Because I think one of the things that's kind of going on right now is America's always been polarized, but it's seeming to become more and more polarized, is that you've got the left and the right treating each other almost as if though they're one, not American or not patriotic, as MJ said. I think part of that is because, and this is my perspective, one side wants to teach history with all of its good and bad, and the other side wants to teach mythology with only the good, where we've kind of created this faith of originalism, and the founding fathers are sort of like the 12 disciples, and the Federalist Papers are like the good book, and the Constitution is the Holy Grail. But the sides don't treat each other as if they're, sometimes even human. I mean, we look at each other oftentimes as if we're the enemy, and we don't have conversations with one another. A lot of times people will stop being friends, whether via social media or even in person, if they don't share the same political views. And it just creates these echo chambers where people are just being refed all of the same information that they already know, instead of challenging their preconceived ideas and having critical thinking that challenge, that growth. They just stay stuck wherever they are. And I think it's a lot harder to be a jerk to somebody that you have a relationship with. And I think it becomes so easy for people to just attack one another, treat them as if they're not American, not human, the enemy, and sort of live in their own little bubble.
And that's what it is, it's a bubble, and people are living in these individual bubbles and not having those important conversations. But I think that's what learning history teaches us. It teaches us to have conversations. It teaches us to think critically. It teaches us between what is acceptable and what is not in society. And we live in a melting pot. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We are a nation of various ethnicities, various races, various religions, and it needs to remain that. It needs to remain that. People are losing what was fought for. And we're seeing this in other parts of the world right now with, with Ukraine and Russia, how fragile this really is.
This sanitizing of history goes so far back. I mean, we have been doing this since the founding fathers,
True.
and before that. I mean, we have literally tried to water down history throughout our history, and we rely on artists to expand our mind again. But politicians really want to progress their own narrative and people in control, I think, So it worries me that there's so much sanitizing that has happened that we may not ever know the full extent of the history. Like with slavery, I worry that we don't have enough evidence to carry forward to our ancestors in the future, because so much was destroyed. So much. Indigenous stories were destroyed. I feel like, what we did with the Holocaust, where we gathered the stories of all the people who survived it, we have to do that with everything. We have to create a repository because there's always a push against people knowing the truth, the real truth, the hard truth.
I think with our politicians today, too, I mean, we have a lot of politicians who, quite frankly, are in their 70s and 80s, and they came into politics at a time around civil rights, and they grew up in an era where they experienced segregation personally, or their immediate family did, and it affected how they were taught as well and what their belief systems are. I believe we see that play out quite often with politics today because we have so many older politicians and a president as well, in the past. Well, Obama wasn't older, but since the civil rights movement, we've had several older presidents. And
Do you remember Jesse? Oh, what was his name from South Carolina? The
Helms? Jesse Helms?
Jesse Helms. He was really old. He lived to be 90, and
Strom Thurmond, for crying out loud. I
oh,
mean,
is it Strom Thurmond? It's the one that Dana Carvey used to make fun of. He was just awful. He was a segregationist that was still in Congress well into his 80s.
right, right.
And we it was like if you still got people who were sympathetic to those causes, it's hard to get the true story sometimes of what your state went through. I think I didn't learn enough in high school, honestly. I think I was shielded too much from the realities. I didn't have what you had, Tamara. I didn't have a teacher that was bold and brave. I had some that pushed a little bit, but they didn't push me to really. But I also had outlets where I was exploring in other ways. I was a big Stephen King reader, even at 12 years old. I was reading totally inappropriate things at 12 years old. I was reading about murder and vampires and
Did you get those books from the school library?
no, I did not. But I think they did carry Stephen King, didn't they, Dan?
I imagine that they would, yes. Well, probably at least at the high school library.
Yeah, I mean, I think they carried all those writers from that time, all the horror writers. It's easier to carry. I mean, people would rather you talk about horror than talk about racial injustice.
It's true. Look at the movies that parents allow their children to watch, and they're afraid, and then they're afraid of them reading a book.
Yeah, our culture in the United States has a tendency to allow gratuitous violence much more than sexual issues or to truly address racial injustice of the past and present, unfortunately.
To that point, why don't we let the reader decide what they want to read. Our librarians teach kids to be careful on how to select books. So if you're afraid of ghost stories, don't check out the Stephen King, right? So, like, there's that education piece. And then there's also the parent piece where we say, talk to your kids about what you want them to read and what you encourage them to read, because they have a role too. And where the dissonance happens is when some parents want to tell other parents what they should be choosing for their kids.
Right, and that's an important point, right, that we're missing here, and that's part of the legal side of it, right, Dan, where you allow the parents to choose what they want and not dictate what other parents have to do.
It may surprise you to know that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights specifically provides that parents have the right to choose the kind of education that their children should have. And I know under Michigan law, we have the revised school code that basically gives public school districts their authority. And there's a section of that code that specifically says that it's the fundamental natural right of parents to determine and direct the care, teaching, and education of their children. Now, parents are kind of taking that out of context and basically saying that that says whether or not kids have to wear a mask or not, whether or not kids, should be able to access books. And what they seem to want to do under this guise of parental rights is say not only what is appropriate for their child, but for all other children in the district. So my understanding is some districts, and I think the one that Mary Jane works at might be doing this, where it allows parents to have some control over what their individual child checks out from the library without removing the book. And so that walks that nice balance of allowing the parent to exercise their natural fundamental right to direct the education of their child while allowing other parents to do that too and not violate the student's right to have access to material through the public school library.
That I would be in total agreement with. Keeping the book there and then allowing the parent to decide if their child reads it or not, rather than banning books completely. Do you know, are there challenges in states where books have been banned already to allow that? Is that something that's happening at a national level, or is that more just like an individual school district?
I have not heard whether there are any current legal challenges. The law firm that I work with, we represent over 500 school districts throughout the state of Michigan, and we were just kind of addressing this issue and putting a policy together over the last couple of months too. And none of the attorneys that work in this area have mentioned any legal challenges here in Michigan that are going through the court system at this time. So I can't speak to anything with my own personal knowledge.
But Dan, if I were in my current school district, for instance, if the school was able, or the school board was able to successfully remove books from my child's school library, as a parent of that child, wouldn't I have a right to say my child's rights are being violated because they no longer have access to that book?
You could. It's what you would call standing in the courts that you have suffered an injury. And so you'd be able to bring an action. And as I mentioned earlier, it was a plurality decision in PICO from, I think, maybe 1982, 1984. The composition of the court has changed a little bit. And so there's always the possibility that the United States Supreme Court, as it currently exists, would overturn that precedent. But under current precedent right now, you would have a very strong claim that your constitutional and civil rights of your child are being violated and that you would succeed at federal court. And typically, under these Section 1983 cases under the Civil Rights Act, you would be awarded attorney fees as well. So it shouldn't cost you, in a sense, anything out of pocket to bring a challenge to a school district that were violating students' rights by removing books from the library.
Interesting. So there's more ability there to take the opposing side, with the same concern. Essentially, my concern is the same. I think my child is not having fair or well, their concern, of course, is censorship, but essentially, we're trying to say that this is what our child is supposed to have or not have.
Yeah, that ability to receive ideas.
So that makes me want to talk about the health benefits of having a balanced collection in a library. When some of our students spoke very plainly about the fact that when they checked out books and read main characters that were like themselves, it validated their existence, made them feel connected. And in one student's testimony, he said it saved his life. He was depressed, had suicidal thoughts, checked out a book where the character was going through the same thing. And the book encouraged him to talk to his parents and get therapy and go on medication. He did this at a Board of Education meeting.
Wow.
Good for him.
So
Yeah.
brave.
Very brave.
Additionally, just recently had access to the youth assessment survey in our county, where they surveyed 49% of all 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in our county. So half. That's a pretty great number for a survey, a very reliable number. And the biggest problems in our county right now are bullying, depression, suicide ideation, and attempts. And this is happening with students that have gender issues, marginalized groups, and girls. These people need infrastructure to bolster their mental health. So, part of that is having an adult that you can talk to that's trusted. And part of that infrastructure is having books that relate to you, windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And then also a strong mental health system like with social workers and such. But don't negate the value of a library book, any book, whether it's in the classroom library, your home library, the school library, the public library, of providing the support a child needs.
When is the last time you think the citizens, the parents have addressed the mental health crisis in schools right now or during the pandemic and beyond? When's the last time they came to a school board with concern about that? Those three things you talked about: bullying, depression, and suicide or gender issues.
Lashia, first I want to ask if I'm pronouncing your first name correctly.
Very close. It's Leisha.
Leisha, our parents that oppose library books do not want any social, emotional support for mental health or well-being in the schools. They want us to focus on the core subjects, and they're pretty explicit.
But then they go back to the schools many times and blame the school for not recognizing certain behavior in their children.
Exactly, Tamara. So the books are actually, they support our efforts to socialize children. Banning them is counterintuitive. They work against our efforts to create a belonging environment.
I have to give you a lot of credit, Mary Jane. I don't know that I'd have the patience that you have to deal with this from parents. Truly do not.
You don't want to field some phone calls, Tamara,
Oh
from
my
some angry
goodness.
parents?
No, you don't want me fielding phone calls for sure. Definitely not me.
Okay, I think I might be able to use you on the phone line.
Well, that kind of takes us into a segue of I understand that you have been targeted by some parents. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
At more than one Board of Education meeting, parents have named me as creating curriculum all by myself, as naming what is taught and not taught all by myself, and that what I choose is inappropriate. They've also named that I have selected professional development for teachers that creates division and shame within our staff and with our students. And they based some of these decisions on a FOIA request where they got a couple of slide presentations out of context without hearing the totality of what was being presented, nor do they understand the process for adopting curriculum. What I'm saying to you is a little benign, yes. It was really hurtful. They were aggressive. Some people might have even called it abusive. And, it's difficult to explain. It just felt like if people in the Holocaust and the civil rights movement could tolerate what they did, then I can tolerate what was said about me at a Board of Education.
So it kind of goes back to your point of indoctrination. They were accusing you basically of indoctrinating the children, the students, as well as the staff to do exactly what? What was the actual accusation? What were you supposedly doing that they were accusing you of?
Yes, I was creating shame for white people.
Shame for white people, white racism.
It's pretty succinct. Yep.
It makes me so sad because teachers do so much, Educators are like everything. I mean, they have to be social workers, they have to be parents, they have to be hairdressers, they have to be nutritionists. And it makes me so frustrated that people would target teachers as anything but people who have nothing but the best or educators in the education system have nothing but the best intentions for these kids. I mean, they devote their whole life to it. Your whole life, isn't being an educator. And I'm so sorry, Mary Jane. That's awful.
Well, thank you for your support. It was a couple of bad nights, but we bounce back, don't we?
Absolutely.
One of the things that I'm seeing with these attacks on educators that I think does show that it goes beyond, in a sense, the parents' right to direct their own child's education is oftentimes parents are attacking people like Mary Jane, who, while the curriculum director probably has no direct interaction with any of the children herself, but they're also attacking teachers sometimes that their students don't even have, that their children aren't in their classes, and sometimes even in different districts. It's kind of part of that organization where we're having some parents come from neighboring school districts to complain about books that we might have on our library shelves. And so it really seems to go beyond this idea of trying to direct your own child's education and going back at that sort of fundamental issue of wanting sort of power and control over the public school education.
It's like birdshot, right, Dan?
Yes.
Get as many people as you can.
Baffling to me. It truly is.
Just hammer and hammer and hammer until you find a weak point.
It's hard for me to wrap my head around a parent not wanting their child to learn. My son is an insatiable reader. I feel it's because I started reading to him at a young age, but it's also because I allowed him to choose what he liked to read because I wanted reading to be enjoyable to him because I didn't want him to be one of those kids that so many people in my family that say, I hate reading. How do you hate reading? Number one, I don't get that at all. But number two, I didn't want that for him. And I wanted him to learn and to love to read because reading is the gateway to literally everything I think in life. You figure out who you are, you figure out what direction you want to go in life, you figure out what you enjoy, what your passion is, and I think most of that comes through reading. The happiest people I know are readers. Some of the most miserable people I know are not readers, and I feel so strongly about that. And because of this, I mean, my child was reading at high school level in the 7th and 8th grade, and he's a huge history buff. He knows more about history than I think a history professor with a PhD knows, I swear, and he will credit YouTube, so thank you, YouTube, on that, but it's such an important aspect of life, and I cannot wrap my head around these parents that look at it as indoctrination and not free thought. Think for yourself. We hear that from them all the time. Think for yourself, think for yourself, think for yourself. How are you going to teach a child to think for themselves if you are cutting off every source or the books or a curriculum that is actually teaching them to think for themselves?
And not just think for yourself, but as you were talking about, Mary Jane, when people read and develop empathy for characters, it really improves their emotional development. I need my child to have access to things that enhances his emotional development as much as I do his mental development. And very good point you made though about, how the books were a tool to improve the mental health of your students.
That's a big one for Alicia.
I'm a counselor by trade, so I'm all about mental health.
Yes, and the counterpoint to that is what you read isn't contagious. If you're reading about gender identity, you're not going to catch it.
It's interesting that parents think that if a child learns about that, that they're going to want to become that it is indoctrination into something, learning about something like that.
I didn't want to become, a vampire because I read Anne Rice.
Right.
Although I did want to interview the vampire because I thought that was really cool.
That is funny.
That's
It
a good one. I
really
like
is,
it.
yeah. That's such a powerful statement. What you read is not contagious. That is a
That
powerful
is.
statement.
One of the things that I think some parents are concerned about, though, is that what you read does change you. It's not contagious, but it might open up your mind. And I do believe that there are some parents out there who think that that would not necessarily be a good thing with their kids. There are some parents whom I think don't want their children to be independent, critical thinkers. I think they want them to kind of follow the authority. This idea that there is a moral authority and it's not me and it's not you. It comes from our holy scriptures. And so if you start reading books that challenge your preconceived ideas based upon those scriptures, and it sort of changes you. I think parents are a bit fearful of that.
They often bring up books of religious nature that are not Christianity, maybe books that talk about Islam or Buddhism. Do those often come into the discussion?
Not locally, however, they're on the list. They're on the local list to read and bring forward. We just haven't heard about them yet.
There is a great book by a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who just recently passed away, Thich Nhat Hanh, called Jesus and Buddha as Brothers, or and Living Buddha, Living Christ, that kind of compares and contrasts some of their quotes and statements, which is phenomenal. I don't know if it's in the public school library. I know it's in my personal library, but
That would be considered a religious book, though, right? That wouldn't be in a school library, would it?
schools can have religious books. So there's this other idea that a lot of people don't understand in terms of the Establishment Clause under the First Amendment, where we've got that separation of church and state. Schools do need to be neutral. We can have religious books in our library, including the Bible, the Torah, any religious book, and books about religion. Schools can even teach world religion classes. I'm going to guess that the high school at the school district where Mary Jane teaches, or not, excuse me, is the curriculum director, they might even have a world religions class. We can teach about religion, but we can't do that indoctrination. And so you could have books in the library. I know in particular, like Thich Nhat Hanh has really helped me with respect to like anger management and mindfulness and all those things. And I came about finding him when I was in law school because Notre Dame had a professor, Tom Morris, who was a professor on the philosophy of religion. And he wrote a book on success that quoted Thich Nhat Hanh, and one book led to another, which led to probably like 20 in my collection of books by this wise Vietnamese monk.
Mary Jane, do you have religious books in your library? Is the Bible there? Is the Quran there? Is Bhagavad Gita? Is any of that in the library at your school? Do you know?
Yes, they
They
are.
are. I didn't realize that. I'm sure they were when I was in school too, but
I'm going to call on Dan for help, but if they're not there, I think it's also a violation of neutrality. So the Bible is there as an academic resource, and the Torah isn't there because that's in a scroll and it's hard to keep. But we probably have a bound copy of that as well. And we teach a world religions class that the first lesson is the First Amendment and how we're going to teach this in a neutral way.
I love that there's a world religion class in a public school.
Absolutely.
It's the first I've heard of that. I want to go back and touch on the racism thing again. Do you see racism and bigotry playing a role in the parents' decision for this crusade that they are on to ban books?
Tamara, I don't like to call anybody a racist. I see white privilege and fear as a driving force behind this work. The authors that they want removed are non white authors, not 100%, but largely. And it's not just in our school district, it's all over the county. This is a very pervasive effort. So while books are supposed to help people and create empathy and connect kids, we're just not supposed to help people who are Black or Latinx or have gender identity. Like, we're just not going to help those people. And is that what those parents are thinking? Because that's the message I'm getting.
That's a question, is why are these parents not looking at these students as a part of humanity? You know, and you just said something that made me think of something, because I was in a group of people this past week and talk of transgenderness and pronouns came up. And I'm in my hometown in Michigan right now. I'm not in Austin, Texas. And my son was with me. My son is 17 years old. He has transgender friends. He has experienced this. This child's mind is as wide open as a child's mind can be, because he's actually gone through the experiences and had friends who are transgender. And I had to get him out of there. He's ready to lose it. And he's usually really good, mild-mannered kid and can take people's opinions and look at various sides of something and have a conversation with people, but they were having conversations at a sense to where it was a talking about physical harm of transgender kids. And these are people that you would think were good people. All white, I'm going to say that because I do think that plays a factor in a lot of this rhetoric. Middle class, white, Midwestern people, but there's this level of fear of the unknown. And in this fear of the unknown, the dialogue that they're having and the conversations that they're having, it's so harmful. And it's at a level that I don't even think they understand how harmful they're being because they're literally talking about hurting children and that these children and these people have no place in society. But it goes back to that level of fear, that these people are operating from fear of the unknown. But what is so frightful about a transgender student, a transgender child? What are they afraid of?
I'm going to speak specifically. There are teachers in our district who said at the elementary level that if you have the book Call Me Max in our library, we might resign
Teachers said
because
this.
a teacher, yeah, multiple, not the majority, but more than one. And they said, what we say to our students, our words hang on the moon. That's a quote. So, what we tell them, if we read them this book, Call Me Max, then they might think that gender is a choice. And we don't believe it is. So, while I'm not answering your question, I'm providing you a real example of what happened when a book about transgender accidentally landed in some students' hands without parent permission.
That's for the child to decide, right? Especially at a high school level. And I think that's where we're failing as adults in this country. We're saying that you're choosing to be something that you wouldn't choose to be if this book weren't available to you. So with this book not being available to you, you're never going to choose to be transgender when it's not a matter of choice.
But it is, it's usually the case. I mean, it definitely is with your sexual preference. But people who have the most vocal and adamant objection to the point that they want to kill trans people is because at a deeper level they're not dealing with something of their own. And it's probably maybe some gender ambiguity they had at some point, probably nothing that maybe is to the level of transgender, but the most vocal people are always the people who harbor some secret feelings that they haven't dealt with. What Shakespeare said, he doth protest too much.
And our local youth are telling us that those who have gender issues have the highest rate of suicide ideation, attempt, and completion. Who would choose that?
And why should we fault them either way? I mean, why would we ever come down on a child for anything that they're grappling with, Whether it be their gender or their friendships or whatever, they need support, not I mean, to me, it borders on abusive, really. When you come down on a child for things that they're trying to deal with, that's the worst kind of emotional abuse you can give someone.
Agreed, right? That's a parent pivot point. Are you going to use blame or are you going to support?
I mean, we're putting so much pressure on our kids, and all of this falls
So
on
much
them.
pressure.
It's you can't read this, you can't do that. You're a child, yet you're old enough to know how to do this. We're going to treat you like an adult in this situation. We're going to treat you like a child in this situation. You can't think for yourself. I'm going to tell you how you need to think, but you need to think for yourself. It's just I am glad I am not, I'm glad I am a product of the 70s and 80s because I don't know, it's so stressful for children, and I even saw it in my own son, with the struggles that he had when he hit puberty and was in school and the education that he was receiving and what he was reading and things that helped him and things that didn't and the pressure that, he made me aware that I was putting on him in certain situations. And we're not allowing our kids to, I don't know, I think we're just stifling their growth so much right now in so many ways.
They've just went through a pandemic where all of their social relationships ground to a halt. Can we not give kids a break for for not having everything figured out? We just put them through a year of in-home learning and
Well said. Like, what are all the ways we can socialize them? Aren't books a part of
Books are a
that?
huge part of that, absolutely.
absolutely.
I would imagine that during COVID, a lot of kids read more versus reading less. There has to be a statistic out there because it's an escape for a lot. It was an escape for me as a kid. I mean, I read books as an escape.
Absolutely.
There wasn't nearly as much available back then as there is now in every area.
Can you imagine having a Kindle in the 80s where you could just download any
Would have been
book you wanted
wonderful.
at any time.
Dan, did you read more during COVID?
I don't really know. I do read a lot. I mostly read nonfiction. I do feel like I read quite a bit. When our kids were little too, we would always try to make sure that we had a big library of both children's books and adult books. And my wife and I would typically try to model reading behavior. And in fact, in our upstairs living room, we didn't have a television. So we'd usually sit upstairs, listen to music, and be sitting in chairs or on the couch reading. I'm trying to remember during COVID, my kids were home. It's one of these sort of like good luck, bad luck types of things in terms of a Buddhist story where you think it's a pandemic, how awful that must be. And while there are bad things that are happening, it was also nice to have my children home when the George Floyd incident happened so that I could spend the morning working from home, talking with my kids about things like white guilt, where I have a 20-year-old son saying how bad he feels about being born as a straight white male. And I told him, that's out of his control. You don't have to feel bad or guilty for being born straight white male, but you have to understand that there are privileges that come with that. And what are you going to do with the privileges that you have? What are you going to do to try to make the world more just for other people? And so we would pull out records and would play certain records that I remembered listening to when I was in college around the time of the Rodney King beatings, and thinking to myself, not a lot has changed in the 25, 30 years since I graduated from college. Unfortunately, there are still African American males who are unarmed that are being shot and killed by police. And I joked sort of with my son because I sat him down one time and had him watch the NWA movie and told him that when I was around his age in college, I thought my generation would make a difference with respect to racial relations with NWA and F the Police and Public Enemy
Tupac.
and yeah, all that. And I said, unfortunately, Ice Cube didn't make a difference. He's made millions of dollars in the movies, but he, just didn't really make a lasting difference. And hopefully, while my generation might have let him down with respect to race relations, his generation will get things right. Because if we don't, it's going to be a shame for all of us and the ramifications of that.
I think something you said is very important because it goes to what Mary Jane was saying about the fear of parents, about white guilt. And what you said is incredibly important. And I think that should be the white person's talking point, what you said, that we have an awesome responsibility because we have set up these systems of racism and oppression in this country. The white people have done that. And that we have an important role to play in tearing them down and making things more equal and progressing democracy. So that's a great talking point to overcome the guilt and the fear that some of these parents have is that, yes, this happened in our history. No, we were not directly responsible for it, but we are directly responsible for being better and making it better and doing better. I mean, honestly, I think that is such a powerful point that you made because your son is feeling what some of these parents are saying they're afraid their kids are feeling, and you handled it beautifully by telling him he has the
Well, thanks.
responsibility to be and do better and to change, to make the change.
It's just like what Spider-Man says, with great power comes great
Responsibility.
responsibility.
Yes. Well, now you have to write a book, Dan Martin, on that.
Well, there we go.
A children's book that will eventually be banned. No, just kidding.
I do want to share with you a story from eighth grade that I have
Yes,
with
please.
respect to some of the stuff that we've been talking about. When I was in eighth grade, I was a big fan of musicians, and a number of musicians wore earrings. And I came from a single family. My mom was basically raising me at the time. My parents got divorced when I was in third grade. So in eighth grade, I thought I wanted to get my ear pierced. And my mom told me that if I could wear one of her clip on earrings to school all week long and still wanted to get my ear pierced, she would allow me to do
That is
so.
awesome.
So I tried to find the most masculine looking hoop clip on earring that she had, and I wore it to my first hour class. And I did wear it all week, but I remember going into my first hour class, and my teacher said to me, "So which are you?" And I said, "What do you mean, which am I?" And she said, "Are you a queer or are you a pirate? Because you got to be one or the
Oh my
other,"
gosh.
which you
Oh my
couldn't get
god.
away with
You
anymore.
could
But because it was my
not.
favorite teacher, Helen Heyer, I thought it was perfectly fine.
She was the best teacher ever, I'm telling you.
It was Helen Heyer?
It
Same
was Helen
teacher.
Heyer, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So, well, hoop earrings in
Great.
the 80s were not small. So, how big was this hoop earring?
It was probably about the size of a quarter.
That's hilarious.
That's pretty big.
Gosh, that's
It was about the smallest, most masculine one my mom had in her collection.
Yeah, pirate size.
That
Pirate
is so
size.
funny. I loved her.
And
I
did you
loved her.
eventually get your ear pierced?
I did not, because it turned out trying to wear an earring with a catcher's helmet mask and everything was not very comfortable.
That is wonderful.
I bet.
Mary Jane, are there any organizations in your area that we could tag in our show notes?
What did you call that women's organization?
Red, White, and Wine. I'm going to put that in there for
like
sure.
WINE?
Yes.
Yes. The Momentum Center in Grand Haven has an anti-racism task force and a mental health component of their organization. They do amazing work and they're incredibly responsive to community requests. They have a strong backing of the public education and defense of DEI efforts. I might also recommend, if this has a place, they accept donations, but A Long Talk About an Uncomfortable Truth is an organization that provides free training on how to talk about race from master teachers. It is the best education training I've ever had. It's a 4-hour training over 2 nights. So 2 hours, 2 nights. It's free. They offer it every single month.
Wow. Okay.
alongtalk.com. And I'm telling you, you come out of there feeling empowered, educated. The lessons that you may have missed in history come out here, and they teach you how to talk about race and give you opportunities to practice.
That is fantastic.
Wow. Absolutely great.
I'd like to applaud this group for talking about a very important issue rather than not talking about it. Because when we talk about our problems, we find solutions. That might seem oversimplified, but that's essentially what happens through discourse.
Well, I have to say, you two have given me hope tonight because I thought I was going to be pretty depressed, but hearing your passion and your knowledge and just your understanding of the bigger picture, it's given me a lot of hope. So I appreciate both of you for sharing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Humanhood. We are happy you are here. For a breakdown of this episode, please visit pcspodcast.com/humanhood for our show notes and for more information on how you can get involved. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us grow by giving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and supporting us through Patreon by becoming a founding member. As a founding patron, you receive a special subscription rate that will lock in for the life of your subscription. We provide our patrons with a plethora of awesome behind-the-scenes perks and special merchandise, along with access to our Patreon-exclusive podcasts, Drunk Politics and WTF. Become a founding member today at patreon.com/powerfulpodcasts or find the link in our show notes. This podcast is brought to you by Powerful Podcasts and is written, produced, and hosted by me, Tamara Graham, with co-host Alicia Moody Miller. You can find us at pcspodcast.com or wherever you find your podcasts. For a full list, please refer to our website. Follow us on social media at Powerful Podcasts and on Twitter at Powerful Pods. Be sure to join us next week for another powerful episode of Humanhood.